Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Derek Attridge, Emeritus Professor in the Department of English and Related Literature at the University of York and a Fellow of the British Academy. He is the author or editor of 30 books across several fields, including literary theory, South African literature, the history and forms of poetry, and the work of James Joyce. His most recent book is The Experience of Poetry, From Homer's Listeners to Shakespeare's Readers, published in 2019, and forthcoming in 2023 is Forms of Modernist Fiction, reading the novel from James Joyce to Tom McCarthy. He was a recipient of the Robert Fitzgerald Prosody Prize, and his book, The Singularity of Literature, won the European Society for the Study of English Prize for Literary Studies in 2006. Before moving to York, he taught at Oxford, Southampton, Strathclyde, and Rutgers universities, and he has held visiting professorships or fellowships in the UK, USA, Italy, France, Germany, South Africa, and Egypt. One of the things that makes Professor Attridge's work so special, in my opinion, is his willingness to apply the same sophisticated analysis of technical form to verse written for children and adults alike, taking seriously the experience of poetry in the nursery, on the playground, and across the pages of children's books. And it's this world of verse that forms the subject of his talk today, Playful Rhythm, the Metrical Craft of A.A. Milne. So please join me in welcoming Professor Attridge.
Thank you very much, Kate. It's great to be here. Jet lag is not too bad at the moment, so let's hope I get to the end of the hour in one piece. Alan Alexander Milne was born in 1882, the same year as James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. Like them, he published his most successful works in the 1920s, far more successful in terms of sales than those two modernist giants. One estimate from 20 years ago puts the sale of the Winnie the Pooh books at 70 million. Milne's two books of verse for children, When We Were Very Young and Now We Are Six, must be among the highest selling collections of poetry ever produced by a single author. I'd like to argue that one reason for this success is Milne's remarkable handling of one of the oldest metrical forms in the English language, the verse form used in the earliest poems and a staple of popular verse ever since, as well as a resource drawn upon by many poets. It's also a form that has seldom been recognized as a distinctive way of writing verse in English, which may be one reason why Milne's achievements have not been fully acknowledged by literary critics. As we all know, when we explain a joke, it ceases to be funny. And I realize that in putting Milne's playful verse under the metrical microscope may overburden it with analytical machinery from which it'll take some time to recover. However, I'm confident that the poems will survive this treatment, and I hope that by demonstrating that their pleasurableness and popularity are not the product of chance, but of remarkable poetic skill, I can increase the standing in the aesthetic universe of both Milne and other writers who write enjoyable verse in the same vein. In 1924, A.A. Milne was best known as the author of light verse published in the satirical magazine Punch, of which he became assistant editor, a crime novel, and several plays. His son, Christopher Robin, turned 4 that year, and it was with this child in mind that he wrote the poems of When We Were Very Young, followed in 1927, 3 years later, by Now We Are Six. In the meantime, he completed Winnie the Pooh, published in 1926, and The House at Pooh Corner came out the year after, Now We Are Six. So in 4 years, Milne had produced what remains one of the most loved and admired body of work in prose and verse for children, work that's capable of bringing immense pleasure to adults as well. Milne was very conscious of the craftsmanship that went into these poems. He writes in his autobiography, It's Too Late Now, I think that such merit as attaches to the verses this is of when we were very young, was won by taking pains, more pains perhaps than is usual. Whatever else they lack, the verses are technically good. The practice of no form of writing demands such a height of technical perfection as the writing of light verse. When we were very young is the work of a light verse writer taking his job seriously, even though he is taking it into the nursery. Light verse, Milne argues, I quote, observes the most exact laws of rhyme and meter, as if by happy accident. And he continues, it is not the output of poets at play, but of light verse writers at the hardest and most severely technical work known to authorship. That's quite an extraordinary claim to make for somebody who's best known as a writer of children's verse. The hardest and most severely technical work known to authorship. Milne was also very aware of the close relationship between verse for children and music. He writes in the preface to the Christopher Robin storybook, which is a selection of poems and stories from his already published works, every piece of poetry has a music of its own, which it is humming to itself as it goes along. And every line, every word in it has to keep time to this music. If you can find words which keep time to the music, and which are just the words you want to say, then the verses which you write are verses which sing themselves into people's heads and stay there forever, so that even when they are alone and unhappy, they have this music with them for company. So it's really taking up that challenge in a way that Milne offers, that his work, his poetry, is technically demanding, technically very carefully planned and thought through and organized, and the idea that the closeness of his poetry for children and music is part of what makes them stick in people's minds, which those of you who know these poems will know that that is very, very true. In 1925, Milne published a collection of stories called A Gallery of Children. It's the one work of children for this period that's not well known, and perhaps deservedly so. So it's not a great book. It includes one story told in verse with commentary on the writing as it goes on. And the interest of this for me is that it captures something of the pleasure that the poet took in his own acts of composition. Here's an example from this book. So we've had 3 verses of this poem that is emerging, story of which is emerging. Now he writes 4th verse. This is going to be a good one. Belinda had a bathing gown which had been brown a week before. The envy of her native town, the bathing gown Belinda wore. Not great poetry, and it's not meant to be great poetry. But Milne writes, I like that verse. Besides being good poetry, it explains everything. But since it doesn't, in fact, explain very much, there follows a prose account of the changing color of this bathing gown. Then Milne offers a rewritten version of the stanza. So we have it now in short lines. Belinda wore a bathing gown, brilliant brown, the week before. The local store had turned it down, the bathing gown Belinda wore. And he comments, and the narrator of the story comments, there's obviously irony playing throughout this piece. I think it looks nice spread out like that. I will tell you a secret now. When people pay you to write poetry for them, as they often do, they pay you so much for every line you write. So sometimes you feel that a verse looks nice spread out, and sometimes the man who is paying you feels that it doesn't. It's just a matter of taste. Then there follows the 5th verse. The author comments, I'm not counting the last one because it's a different type from the others. And in this last verse, the 5th verse, another feature of style, of Milne's characteristic style is evident. and that's to say his play with the look of the poem on the page. And in a sense, he's already done this by what he calls spreading out. So instead of the words 3 and 8, he writes the figures. Belinda was as brave as 3. Belinda was as brave as 8. Thanks, Kate. She waited calmly while the sea came in at a tremendous rate. And unlike the unfortunate children in Hilaire Belloc's cautionary tales, some of you may know these, all children come to nasty ends, Belinda survives this calamity. And Milne uses italics, which is another part of his characteristic part of his style, to heighten the comic aspect of his tale. A monster wave came rolling on. It washed Belinda's castle down, and in a moment they were gone, the castle and Belinda Brown. They found her later on the hill, a mile or so above the town, a little out of breath, but still undoubtedly Belinda Brown. Milne can even deliberately puncture the sprightly rhythm of his verse. The following is also from a story in A Gallery of Children, and it rolls off the tongue beautifully until the last word. Diana Fitzpatrick Mauleverer James was lucky to have the most beautiful names. How awful for fathers and mothers to call their children Jemima or nothing at all, but hers were much wiser and kinder and cleverer. They called her Diana Fitzpatrick Mauleverer James. And the word James comes in there to ruin everything. Now, there are 44 poems in When We Were Very Young and 35 in Now We Are 6. You can also consider the poems that occur in the two Winnie the Pooh books, later published separately as The Hums of Pooh, of which there are 17. Metrically speaking, they fall into three categories. The first category consists of poems with irregular meters that avoid falling into the strong rhythms of traditional verse by varying the units of the poetry. They are, as Pooh might say, not hummable. One example is Twinkle Toes. When the sun shines through the leaves of the apple tree, when the sun makes shadows of the leaves of the apple tree, then I pass on the grass from one leaf to another, from one leaf to its brother. Tiptoe, tiptoe, here I go. Poems like this, and there are very few in these collections, I would say are among the least memorable of Milne's output, as if he's going against his own instincts to write these few irregular poems and somewhat sentimental poems. The second category are the poems in accentual syllabic meter. That's to say, poems in which both the number of stresses and the number of syllables are controlled. As I'm sure you know, accentual syllabic verse has been the main vehicle for English literary verse since Chaucer, and it's traditionally named after Greek meters. Its most common forms are iambic pentameter, or 5-beat verse in strict accentual syllabic meter, and iambic tetrameter, or the strict line with 4 beats. Iambic pentameter is the chosen meter for most of the major poems in the canon that use regular verse, including the larger part of the Canterbury Tales, Spenser's Faerie Queen, Shakespeare's plays, Milton's Paradise Lost, Pope's satires, Wordsworth's Prelude, and Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh. But there's also a considerable body of tetrameter or 4-beat verse, which has often been used for more lyrical or light-hearted poetry. There's only one example of pentameter verse in Milne's writing for children, and it's an example that refuses to take the form seriously. In 1917, he published Once on a Time, a story based on and making fun of the traditional fairy tale plot. It's not very well known, and for good reason. His faux naive style seems unsure of its audience. It's not quite clear whether he's writing for adults and making fun of children's stories, or whether he's writing for rather sophisticated children who see the irony of what he's doing, and the jokes tend to fall rather flat. But at one point in the narrative, the Lady Belvane is composing an epic for a competition she happens to be the judge for as well. Leave that aside. The opening lines of her poem reveal that, as would be expected in an English epic, it's in iambic pentameter, and it employs what have come to be known as heroic couplets. So this is how it begins. King Merriwig the First rode out to war, as many other kings had done before. 500 men behind him marched to fight. The narrative then describes Belvane's labours at this point in her composition and adds a comment. There follows a good deal of scratching out, and then comes a sudden inspiration, this sublimely simple line. Left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. One can almost hear the men moving. This is Milne's dig at a certain kind of literary criticism, which is criticism you can still encounter today. One can almost hear the apple falling or the stream flowing. Lady Belvane then goes on to complete 6 more lines of her iambic pentameter epic. What gladsome cheers assail the balmy air. You'll note the use of the iambic pentameter is very regular and dull, just dum to dum. I like that left, right, right. What gladsome cheers assailed the balmy air. They came from north, from south, from everywhere. No wight that stood upon that sacred scene could gaze upon the sight unmoved, I ween. No wight that stood upon that sacred spot could gaze upon the sight unmoved, I wot. And this elicits another critical comment from the narrator. It is not quite clear whether the last couplet is an alternative to the couplet before, or is purposely added in order to strengthen it. Finally, after composing 5 more lines, equally banal in rhythm and content, she reaches the name Hyacinth at line end, and she's unable to think of a rhyme for it. Plinth was a little difficult to work in. Besides, she reminded herself, I don't quite know what it means. Belvane felt as I do about poetry, that however incomprehensible it may be to the public, the author should be quite at ease with it. Milne's jokey way with pentameter writing in this example may not be very significant, but it's hard not to see it as lampooning an alternative school of poetry by a writer who prefers to play with the 4-beat form. Milne's own accentual syllabic poems are all versions of the 4-beat line, which, unlike the 5-beat line, lends itself to being subdivided or combined, and often makes use of what I call virtual beats, beats that are felt but not actualized in syllables. But when these words are set to music, these virtual beats or unheard beats will often, or almost always, be heard in the music. The rhythm that's produced by this sequence of 4 beats invites further structuring in 4s. 4, 4, 4, 4. Here's an example from Now We Are 6 with a simple method of scansion underneath the lines. So as I read it, you'll see under the lines the upper and lowercase letter B for the beats, and a number in between the beats, which in this case is always 1, because this is strict accentual syllabic meter, so there's no variety in the number of syllables. And as you'll see, it's 4 lines of 4 beats, which is the absolutely standard 4-beat stanza form. And the rhymes are the first 2 and the second 2 lines, making couplets. I think I am a muffin man. I haven't got a bell. I haven't got the muffin things that muffin people sell. Perhaps I am a postman. No, I think I am a tramp. I'm feeling rather funny, and I don't know what I am. So the scansion here shows the regularity of the meter, and it actually because I've used the reason why I've used the upper and lowercase b's is that because the beats themselves tend to alter in strength from stronger to weaker. It's what's often called dipodic verse to double-footed verse, we translate that as. So if we look at just the uppercase b's, ignoring the lowercase b's, we find the simplest stanza form of all 4 lines with 4 beats, that I often call 4x4 form. But if we look at all the beats, we'll see that the final weaker beat, where there would be a lowercase b, is missing. And it's something that's easy to hear if we exaggerate the rhyme, exaggerate the rhythm a little. We can show this missing beat by using square brackets. And if we divide the line into 2, its basic structure will be clearer. So I think I am a muffin man. I haven't got a bell beat. I haven't got the muffin things that muffin people sell beat. So if you read that very regularly, if you can chant it as if you were chanting it to a child, it's very clear that we need to pause in those 2 places in order for this missing beat to be felt. Right, let's go back to the whole poem. So what this example shows is that Milne was an expert handler of this traditional form. 2 very regular lines are followed by 2 that offer a slight challenge to the regularity. You'll see the 3rd line, perhaps I am a postman, breaks not after 4 beats, beat, 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 strong weak, as you might expect, which is the norm, but rather after 3. So that word no in the middle of the line gets extra emphasis. It's slightly out of place. And the last weak beat in the 4th line is also emphasized through the use of Milne's favorite device of italics. Which haven't shown up in the text there. I don't know what I am. Should be in italics. However, Milne's poems in regular 4-beat form, such as this one, are not among his most original and memorable. We need to turn to the 3rd category. These poems, which constitute approximately half of the poems for children, are in what we can conveniently call dolnik verse, dolnik meter, D-O-L-N-I-K, which is a Russian term for a very common meter in Russian, but it's a handy way of referring to this English meter as well. It's also got 4 beats. The line is also structured on 4-beat units, if you like, but unlike its tetrameter cousin, it doesn't observe a strict number of syllables per line. That's to say, the number of syllables between the beats can vary, or we could call them offbeats. Let's say there's a single offbeat in this example, just all those ones, but in other poems we'll see there can be 2 or 3, or sometimes no syllables in between the beats in dolnik verse. On the other hand, it doesn't vary these offbeats randomly. It's not as though the poet just sprinkles varying numbers of syllables into his line. The variations in the number of syllables actually intensify the rhythm rather than weaken it. And I hope you'll see that in the examples. Now, there's no sharp boundary between strict tetrameter verse and dolnik, because the former can occasionally have dolnik features. Occasionally you can have an extra syllable here and there. And dolnik verse sometimes drops into the regular alternation of syllables that's characteristic of accentual syllabic verse. Dolnik verse can be predominantly buple, that's to say, it sounds something like the normal iambic verse or trochaic verse. Sometimes it can be predominantly triple, just a 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 time, depending on how many of the spaces between the beats have 2 syllables, how many have 1, and so on. So let me try to clarify this rather abstract conversation so far with some examples which will also, I think, illustrate Milne's great skill in exploiting this form. The earliest and the most famous of the poems in When We Were Very Young is Vespers. Vespers was also the initial poetic venture that led to Milne's burst of writing children. He wrote the poem, having observed his young son. He wrote the poem for his wife, and his wife said, "Do you mind if I send this off publication because it's rather good?" He said, "Okay, go ahead." She sent it to Vanity Fair, very popular magazine, and it appeared in Vanity Fair in January 1923 and was much praised and encouraged Milne to write some more verse for children. Vespers is very much an ironic adult's view of the child saying his prayers, though it is often treated as though it were a sentimental picture of childhood innocence. Readers sometimes miss the irony that's playing throughout. And it uses the Golnick verse, so this is our first example of Golnick verse, in a natural manner. So these are the first 2 stanzas of Vespers. And you'll see now, rather than all those ones showing a single offbeat, a single syllable between the beats, we have 2s, 0s, and a couple of few ones as well. Little boy kneels at the foot of the bed, droops on the little hands, little gold head. Hush, hush, whisper who dares. Christopher Robin is saying his prayers. God bless Mummy. I know that's right. Wasn't it fun in the bath tonight? Cold so cold and the hot so hot. Oh, God bless Daddy. I quite forgot. So the form is the standard 4 lines of 4 beats, rhyming in couplets. But you can see at a glance that it's not accentual syllabic verse. Although the first 2 lines have 10 syllables each, the third line has only 6. The second stanza has lines of either 8 or 9 syllables. Moreover, there's no consistent way of dividing it into so-called feet, as in traditional prosody. In most of the lines, either the first or the last foot has a syllable missing. The scansion makes clear the variation that happens between the beats. Most often 2 syllables, giving this a triple lilt most of the time, but sometimes only 1, and on 2 occasions in line 3, no syllables at all, inviting the reader to pause after those 2 exclamations of hush. So it's quite clear when you read it, hush, hush, whisper who dares. The offbeats are silent, if you like, appropriately for the meaning. The strong rhythm that's set up is such that normally stressed words can lose their emphasis. If you look at line 2, we wouldn't give, reading this with that rhythm running through our heads, we wouldn't give the word gold the stress that it might be expected to have, because that'll upset the rhythm. You wouldn't say droops on the little hands, little gold head. It's droops on the little hands, little gold head. So we actually find ourselves suppressing the normal stress of gold in order to make that rhythm come out. Such variations in pentameter verse would ruin the rhythmic flow of the line, but in this version of 4-beat verse, it strengthens it. Milne himself cites the Victorian light verse poet Charles Calverley as an inspiration, and Calverley certainly knew how to handle Golnick meters. Someone else who more memorably was a brilliant exploiter of Golnick verse was Edward Lear, in poems like The Jumblies, The Gong with the Luminous Nose, and The Owl and the Pussycat. Someone who's sometimes pointed to as a predecessor of Milne is Robert Louis Stevenson, whose Child's Garden of Verses, published in 1885, was extremely popular. However, Stevenson's preferred meter was accentual syllabic, and his poems for children have none of the rhythmic verve and inventiveness of Milne's, and I have to say, have not proved as lastingly popular as Milne's have. I should mention one of the most famous Dolnik poems in the history of English verse, a poem that has baffled many critics trying to scan it by means of traditional foot prosody, Tennyson's poem, Break, 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 which begins with a line like the hush, hush line, no syllables in the offbeats. Two other poets who used Dolnik with great skill were Rudyard Kipling and Milne's near contemporary, someone who died in the same year as Milne actually, Walter de la Mare. But the most obvious source of Milne's facility with this form was the English nursery rhyme, many of which achieve their catchy rhythm through variations on Dolnik meter. In fact, it's hard to find well-known nursery rhymes that don't take advantage of the rhythmic sprightliness and catchiness of Dolnik meter. Now, we've seen how Milne jokes that a poem may look nicer when spread out and earn more if the poet is paid by the line. And he uses to great comic effect the four-beat line's ability to continue to function even when divided up. So here's a poem written in the usual four-line, four-beat Dolnik verse, like our previous example, but although this time it's fundamentally duple rather than triple. You may know this poem, but not quite in this form. It's perfectly normal four-beat form. And as you'll see, the final beat is a virtual beat. John had great big waterproof boots on. John had a great big waterproof hat. John had a great big waterproof Macintosh. And that, said John, is that beat. Now, as with Vespers, there's variation in the number of syllables between the beats, one or two, and the line can begin on the beat or the offbeat. And the final beat is virtual. The rhythm is quite consistent, making one want to tap or nod the head. It's a very strong rhythm we feel very easily. Now, here's the poem as it actually appeared in When We Were Very Young. Same words, but now spread out. Happiness. John had great big waterproof boots on. John had a great big waterproof hat. John had a great big waterproof Macintosh. And that, said John, is that. Each line now has one beat, but the four-beat pattern is still working to keep the poem strongly rhythmic, with the rhyme of hat and that resoundingly rounding off each R. It's the same 4x4 poem with the rhymes at the end of the second and the fourth line when they set out as lines, but it's now working very differently because of the lineation. Instead of the poems ending somewhat anomalously, though, on a virtual beat, the last two words can be pronounced, as I did, as two stresses, just as John might speak them, giving us a pair of final beats. So John had a great big waterproof Macintosh, and that, said John, is that. Instead of, and that, said John, is that beat. Lineation, together with the increased capitalization that it invites, brings out the emphatic, comically self-important manner in which John has apparelled himself, almost daring the weather to be bad. We might note how the word Macintosh resounds as a triumphant climax after the shorter boots, and hat. Now, if we compare the actual poem with the four-line version, there's no doubt that the lineation and pronunciation it encourages are an important element in the poem's comedy and memorability. It's a much more memorable poem in the form in which it actually appeared, even though in some ways it's a very simple device that Milne has used. So these two collections, when we were very young and now we're 6, together with the poems in the Pooh books, demonstrate the enormous variety of which the Dolnik form is capable, in the hands of a craftsman like Milne. I can single out only a few examples to show something of this variety. Here's the first stanza of a poem in Now We Are Six, in which the usual four-beat, four-line structure is expanded into a seven-line unit with a rhyme scheme A, B, A, 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 B, A. And I invite you to spot the deliberate mistake in this scansion. Us too. Wherever I am, there's always Pooh. There's always Pooh and me. Whatever I do, he wants to do. Where are you going today, says Pooh. Well, that's very odd, because I was too. Let's go together, says Pooh, says he. Let's go together, says Pooh. The deliberate mistake, if it was deliberate, is that the first line should go 1B, 2B, wherever I am. And I mistakenly put only a 1. Now, the fourth line of this stanza comes as a surprise, because we'd expect a line of 3 beats plus a virtual beat here, producing the very common structure of the ballad stanza, which has missing beats in the second and fourth lines. The beats go 4-3, 4-3, as with the poem Busy that we looked at earlier. And we'd expect this line, this fourth line, to rhyme with the second line, but instead, Pooh pipes up in a 4-beat line that continues the rhyme of the first and third line, and he goes on for 3 more lines, finally giving us the rhyme we were waiting for in line 6, and the 3-beat line with the virtual beat only in line 7. The effect is to convey something of Pooh's, or maybe the 6-year-old boy's, garrulous tendency, overflowing norms of metrical structure. If you've got that 4x4 rhythm in your head, you may not be aware of it, but you do sense that the poem is going somewhere unusual in that fourth line. Let me just read it again and just think what you would expect that fourth line to do. Wherever I am, there's always Pooh. There's always Pooh and me. Whatever I do, he wants to do. Da-da-da-da-da-da. And it doesn't happen. Where are you going today, says Pooh. Well, that's very odd. And so it goes on until finally we get that virtual beat at the very end. Let's go together, says Pooh. The poem has 4 more stanzas that follow this pattern, using the same rhymes. So this do, Pooh, to, he, Pooh rhyme keeps going every time. The final stanza, after some adventures, like the adventure with turkeys that Pooh insists are dragons, the final stanza echoes the first, but it has a very effective run-on, the first run-on in the poem, that adds a little rhythmic spice to the lines. So wherever I am, there's always Pooh. There's always Pooh and me. What would I do, I said to Pooh, if it wasn't for you? And Pooh said, true, it isn't much fun for 1, but 2 can stick together, says Pooh, says he. That's how it is, says Pooh. I think it's a brilliant slight variation on the earlier stanzas to have that 2 can stick together, as if the 2 lines that have been separated from now are stuck together. Another example, very famous example of a spread out poem in When We Were Very Young, is The King's Breakfast. The King's Breakfast has 8 stanzas, the first 7 of which follow the familiar 4-line, 4-beat structure, with rhymes on the second lines. Once again, here's the first one, not as it appeared on the page, but relineated to bring out that 4-beat structure. The king asked the queen, and the queen asked the dairymaid, could we have some butter for the royal slice of bread? Queen asked the dairymaid said, certainly, I'll go and tell the cow now, before she goes to bed. Very straightforward, 2s and 3s between the beats, rhyming second and fourth line. And it's got that characteristic rhythmic lilt to the rhythm. So again, it's very hummable, as who and Milne might say. But it's actually a little more complex than I've shown there in the scansion. There's a subrhythm that emerges in that second line, where you see there are threes between the beats. And we could scan that with upper and lowercase b's to show a dipodic rhythm, as we did earlier in the poem Busy. So we could scan and read that line with a bit more emphasis on the middle of the threes, if you see what I mean. Could we have some butter for the royal slice of bread? Now, I'm not suggesting we would want to read the poem like that. It's a much livelier poem than I've just read that line. But this subrhythm does add some extra bounce to the lines without diminishing the force of the main beats. So here now is the stanza as set out by Milne. And again, like happiness, this lineation changes our sense of how the words and the meter are relating. The king asked the queen, and the queen asked the dairymaid, would we have some butter for the royal slice of bread? The queen asked the dairymaid. The dairymaid said, certainly, I'll go and tell the cow now before she goes to bed. So by dividing the 4-beat lines up in this way, Milne emphasizes the repetition of this order as it passes down the chain of command from king to queen to dairymaid. The initial request is stated in slightly longer words, but we have some butter for the royal slice of bread. But the dairymaid's response is cut up into even shorter lines to give us that comic rhyme of cow and now, and to allow the subrhythm to emerge. It's a bit like John saying that said John is that the cow now before she goes to bed. Well, the story continues with the cow's observation to the dairymaid that many people nowadays like marmalade instead. A suggestion that's passed from dairymaid to queen and from queen to king in succeeding stanzas, producing great unhappiness on the part of the king. Nobody, he whimpered, would call me a fussy man. I only want a little bit of butter for my bread. Notice the characteristic Milnean italics there. Only. The chain of communication is then resumed from queen to dairymaid, from dairymaid to cow, upon which the cow admits that she didn't really mean it and proffers milk and butter. And the last stanza relates the king's joyful celebration on receiving the butter. All the stanzas, apart from the last, repeat that basic 4x4 pattern, and all ring the changes on the same rhyme at the end of each half stanza, each unit of 8. Bread, bed, we've seen. Bread instead, red spread, bread instead, bed bread, shed bread, and bed bread again. So again, this is Milne's technical virtuosity that he talks about. And this is not just writing as it comes. This is very carefully crafted verse. While the stanzas begin very similarly, the final lines undergo a great deal of variation. Now, okay. Yep, there we go. So I've just given you the final lines of each stanza there. You've seen that broken up ending of the first stanza. I'll go and tell the cow now before she goes to bed. And the next 4 stanzas end as follows, and you'll see they're all different, almost all, that many people nowadays like marmalade instead. But marmalade is tasty if it's very thickly spread. Would you like to try a little marmalade instead? So if I now put in the beats and stronger and weaker beats, I've put in the the underlying secondary rhythm there, and just omitting the offbeats just for sake of simplicity, we'll see how these stand, although they're all using the same meter, they're still using the Dolnik meter and they're still observing that 4x4 pattern, they're actually lineating it differently. Although the second and fourth stanzas have the same pattern of beats, the offbeats between them are completely different. So I'll go and tell how, that's the first one, that many people nowadays at Marmalade instead is very different from would you like to try a little marmalade instead. Then we come to the final stanza, in which the structure of 16 strong beats observed by all the previous stanzas, that 4x4 pattern, is expanded to create a jubilant climax. So this one goes on longer, and you feel the king's joy in getting his butter emerging as the stanza prolongs itself, if you like. The queen took the butter and brought it to his majesty. The king said, "Butter, eh?" and bounced out of bed. "Nobody," he said, as he kissed her tenderly. "Nobody," he said, as he slid down the banisters. "Nobody, my darling, could call me a fussy man, but I do like a little bit of butter to my bread." Now, if this stanza had followed the same pattern as the preceding stanzas, there would have been a word rhyming with bed on the 16th beat to provide a resounding conclusion. Instead, just when we're expecting that rhyme with bed, we have the word banisters, a word which not only doesn't rhyme, but ends with two unstressed syllables. And the stanza dashes on with one more nobody, and then it grinds to a halt with that word but, which I feel has to be read as outside the metrical pattern altogether, to be followed by a final 4-beat line, the only one in the poem that has all 4 beats in one line, in Milne in italics, which at last gives us the rhyme that we've been waiting for many lines, to do like a little bit of butter to my bread. So here's the scansion. As always, there's a variation in the number of syllables between the beats. So the climax is all the stronger for having been delayed by the additional lines and the 3 nobody sections, not to mention the king's successive actions, ending with his trip down the banisters. It's not surprising, I think, that this is one of Milne's most popular poems. For me, Milne's finest metrical achievement is the poem Disobedience, also in When We Were Very Young. I've written about it elsewhere, so I'll just give you the first and last stanzas. Milne exploits to the full the freedom of lineation of which Dolnik verse is capable, heightening the rhythm and conveying thereby the comedy of this 3-year-old's utter seriousness. He also makes use of the incantation-like pronouncement of a long proper name. You may remember Diana Fitzpatrick Maulevera James in the earlier poem. And now we have, so many of you would know, James Morrison Weatherby George Dupree took great care of his mother, though he was only 3. James said to his mother, "Mother," he said he, "you must never go down to the end of the town if you don't go down with me." And to set out to show how the stanza actually consists of 2 4x4 sections in valid form, that's with virtual beats at the ends of lines 2 and 4, we can relineate it like this. So I don't think I need to read it again, but you can see how it is exactly that 4-beat valid form with those virtual beats in the second and fourth lines of each of the halves. I just want to jump to the final stanza, which exhibits Milne's delight in playing with the look of the poem on the page. I'll go on to show you in a scanned form, and I would claim that in spite of it looking so odd on the page, it's still metrical. J, J, M, M, W, G, U, P took great CO his though he was only 3. J, J said to his he said he, you must never go down to the end of the town if you don't go down with me. After 1928, Milne wrote no more children's verse. Christopher Robin grew up, and Milne came to regret the publicity that surrounded his son. He published a collection of light verse for adult readers called For the Luncheon Interval in 1925, reprinting some of the poems that had appeared in his collections of prose pieces, Day's Play of 1910 and The Sunny Side of 1921, and some that had appeared in Punch. Although showing some of the same skill with versification as the poems for children, these poems for adults have not aged well. The most metrically surprising is a poem called Poets at Bridge, in which Browning, Tennyson, Whitman, and Wordsworth play at cards, and Milne indulges in some appropriate parodies of their metrical styles. His only other collection of poems was Behind the Lines, all written, as he notes in his introduction, during the opening 9 months of the Second World War, and published in 1940. Predominantly in accential syllabic pentameter verse and without the inventiveness of his earlier poetry, these poems express Milne's anger at Nazi brutality with a jokiness that often seems very inappropriate. His last verse publication was the long poem, The Norman Church, which I don't think anybody reads. I haven't been able to get hold of a copy. Appeared in 1948, and it relays his unconventional views on religion. Just occasionally, Milne scored a hit with his poetry for adults, and I'd like to end with a Dolnik poem that I think successfully channels the writer's anger into light verse forms. The poem is entitled OBE, that's to say the Order of the British Empire, the dignitaries and people in Britain. And I'm just going to end by reading it. I'm not going to provide a scansion. By now you should recognize the forceful Dolnik rhythm of the poem. I know a captain of industry who made big bombs for the RFC and collared a lot of LSD, and he, thank God, has the OBE. I know a lady of pedigree who asked some soldiers out to tea and said, "Dear me," and "Yes, I see," and she, thank God, has the OBE. I know a fellow of 23 who got a job with a fat MP, not caring much for the infantry, and he, thank God, has the OBE. I had a friend, and he just held the line for you and me and kept the Germans from the sea and died without the OBE. Thank God, he died without the OBE. Thank you for your attention.